And now for another distinction delineated between describing ordinary things and attempting to do so, the secret. Let's make the comparison more interesting tonight and use a compound example. Let's see. How about food and health? Oh, you can talk about food and talk about health, talk about food and talk about health. You can talk about food and talk about health, talk about food and talk about health. Thus did the speaker speak to the crowd. All of the many different mystical methods devised by man are all for the same purpose. Does this come as a surprise to any of you? And many people in the crowd immediately responded by saying, huh? Oh, we're sorry. What'd you say? Addendum. The trouble with booking a good speaker nowadays is that all the good ones speak too simply, and all of the useless ones are too popular. A young girl asked her mother, are we still more or less figuring that all these stories about speakers addressing some crowd or the other are not actually about external events, but rather about something that took place within the comfort and cozy surroundings of one person's mind? And her mom, going along with the gag, turned to the girl and replied, huh? Oh, I'm sorry, what were you saying? And then at that very instant, they heard the threatening sounds of the crowd as they began gathering in front of their house. What makes this so difficult is that it is so simple. Or, what makes this sound so simple is that it is so difficult to explain. Or, what makes this sound so vague is that it is so plain and specific. Or, what makes it sometimes seem so obvious is that it is so obscured. Or, you're sure going to be happily surprised when you finally realize just how plain and simple this actually is. Well, notwithstanding its inherently devilishly tricky nature. A viewer writes, I've been watching your show and you're about to drive me crazy. How much further, you figure, do I have to go? And a father so advised his son, never accept a fool's offer of assistance. And the lad replied, even when it's my own? And they both rolled on the floor with glee until the neighborhood Sirius Patrol began banging on their door. Like many before him, one man, after becoming intimately familiar with the routine workings of his mind, and based on his understanding of the foundation necessary for an alteration of consciousness, decided it would be beneficial to try and hold some specific idea or picture constantly in mind amidst the random, ever-changing ones normally present. And he selected, for no world-shaking reason other than its prima facie appropriateness, the image of Buddha. But like many before him who've attempted such, he quickly discovered that in spite of his best intentions and efforts, the mental picture of Buddha was always in competition with some other image for center stage of his attention, with the competing picture prevailing as often as the one of Buddha. But then this man came up with an extension of this approach, which no records show that anyone previously had conceived of. Now realizing clearly how the routine operations of the human mind are dualistically based, and thus there will be at every given instant two ideas, words, images, simultaneously extant and fighting for momentary supremacy, he decided that rather than leave his intended mental image of Buddha at the mercy of whatever random competing picture that might pop into his mind, that he would provide his own willfully selected second image to go along with Buddha's, so that no matter which one of the two gained the upper hand temporarily in his thoughts, he'd still win. So, rather than leaving this most important effort to chance, he chose, again for no reason other than the fact that he found it enjoyable, a second image to accompany that of Buddha. And from that day on, this man, no matter what else might be running through his thoughts, tried to hold constantly and continually in his mind two images, that of Buddha and of women's breasts. And lest you think I went to all the trouble of relaying such a lengthy tale merely to provoke a laugh, I did not. Hidden and obvious therein is a potentially potent weapon and piece of info. Salt air quiz. Is a sailor concerned about Is a sailor concerned whether waves batter his hull from starboard or from port, or about finding calm seas? What ordinary men call thought is mostly memory. Pushed further, thought is not so dependent and constricted and can be a prelude to an expanded state of awareness. If you do lead an ordinary man into a realization regarding the non-identifiable basis for the mind's operations, after that, 'tis damn near inevitable that he will try and fill in the blanks with notions of God. Even after they've walked the path together for a while, it is at this juncture that many part company, with the dilettante and aging mystics taking the road above noted and the true ones always pushing onward, past all apparent mental and verbal highway obstructions. I just rewrote that one. With the true ones always pushing onward past all apparent lapses in the paving of mental and verbal highways. Take that, editor. There was once a man who wanted to raise corn in his backyard, but discovered there was asparagus already growing there. So he said, what the hell, asparagus it is. Is it actually necessary for me to attach a title of this piece to indicate that about agriculture it is not? There was once a man named Cleveland Grover, who escaped being president only by the skin of his teeth. In consideration of the contemporary interest in things low fat, I'm pleased to point out to you that all ordinary thought is in truth light thought. Though no sane man will knowingly eat contaminated food and will only consume that which he knows to be healthy for his body, why nothing similar in what they normally serve their mind? Why do men continue to take in mentally rations which are obviously to any reasonable observer without nutritional value? That is, what they generally accept in their minds as entertainment, even information, offers no real new knowledge, no uplifting or challenging ideas, and nothing that speaks to the positive future and potential of man. And yet, out in the public marketplace of man's mind, there things stand. And once this is clearly seen and understood aright, a man can retire his attention, nay, he must retire his attention, from this torpid, redundant, lowest common denominator from the past, mass spectacle, and begin to mentally abide solely with himself, and with the stillness that is now his private feast. For his own private purpose, one man rewrote a well-known biblical dictum: be ever vigilant of the mind, for it stalks the world as an insatiable beast, seeking whom and what it may devour, like road signs, billboards, lyrics to songs, and other people's words and ideas, etc. To ever get on, much less trod, the mystical path, a man must have a map, a set of instructions, some system, and yet the day will, without fail, fall upon him when he must see through the frailty, the limits, the transparency of all maps, and take up the individual task of walking on one's own feet, which of course is not a physical matter. And a boy asked his father, or perhaps it was a man asking himself, just when does this time come? And the elder replied, it could come next year, it could come next week, or it could come tomorrow. But one thing's for sure, the time long ago arrived. In fact, on the day you undertook the journey. It's now a question of when you'll realize it, which shut the kid up real good. And relative thereto, a viewer writes, but you once said that a weak man is a happy man. Shut up, viewer. One man finally concluded, believing that the thoughts you think are getting you anywhere is like believing it's possible to dust and vacuum the planet. A speaker was addressing a crowd. To free our minds from mundane shackles, we must forget desire. And one guy asked another, did he say forgive desire? Another guy replied, I don't think it matters. One who knows the secret is like a naked man in the land of the clothed. Naked, I might add, but invisible. Footnote, it is the wise person who does not want to see themselves. And now a quickie quiz from Mr. Science. What is the absolutely stickiest substance known to man? You got it? Thoughts. And Mr. Science adds, how come people don't remember this? Another common religious concept clarified for your motoring pleasure. The idea of penance to a mystic would not be to compensate for being sinful, but for being ordinary. The mind's idea of it. You live, then you die, I don't want to think about it. Instincts. You live, then you die, I'm not able to think about it. So I guess now we leave it as mind 1, instinct 0. Or is it the other way around? The head of one knightly order, before setting the warriors loose on their quest, demanded that each shoot himself in the foot. And one of them asked, does it matter which one? To which the prince replied, yes, now that you ask, both. And he who had asked limped off, a better man for it. As always, I want to remind all of you children watching this at home, get out of there as quickly as possible. There was an old lady who lived in a shoe, but the smell being hers, she didn't go, phew. I'm telling you, get the hell out of there while there's still time. Y'all. Regarding an item read earlier this evening of your rights, but how can you have thought without using memory? I don't understand. And from a 3D level, his confusion is predictable. For how can you journey to another place without starting from here? And yet, continually, at every instant, you can, in your own mind, be trying to strip whatever thoughts are passing there through from their immediately recognizable ties to your past, while attempting to instantly locate some other thought area. Up ahead somewhere, over to the left, over to the right, anywhere but where you find your thoughts to presently be. This is possible. It is non-indigenous to man. It is extremely difficult to remember, but it is possible, just like everything else in the land of the mystical. Today's fairy tale. There was once a man who had a cat and a dog, and he could tell the cat things that he couldn't tell the dog, and he could tell the dog things that he couldn't tell the cat. Till one day it suddenly struck him like a blubber mallet. Wham! This is no cat and dog situation we're dealing with here. This is all about the construction of a man's mind and how, although they both live in the same tree, a worm can't be taught to fly nor a bird to burrow. The only reason that ordinary thinking can stand up at all is because of it having 2 legs. And if you find this to be reasonable and in your favor, then within the unseen confines of a cat and dog story will you happily live ever after. There was once a planet that gave birth to twins, this and that. And there was once a man on the Mystical Express on his way to the secret who decided that perhaps he might get there quicker if he got off. Then there was this other chap whose most prized possession turned out to be a fake. And I'm going to level with you. He was absolutely double down delighted. And if I didn't fear there were some civilians listening in, I'd say, hint, hint, hint. One day, as a kind of joke or something, Life told one guy he'd won a prize, and that he had his choice of the following 3. To have the most active and cram-full of facts mind in the world, or have the most peaceful and satisfied mind in the world, or have no mind at all. And the guy thought about it for a while, then asked Life if it would clarify the exact distinction between numbers 2 and 3. Now, may I suggest to you the 3 following possibilities regarding this incident. 1 is that this story is not as simple and obvious as it may at first sound, or 2, that it is just as plain and obvious, Or 3, that only a patent leather dunce would need to be quizzed on the matter. And a viewer writes, am I supposed to be somehow intellectually offended by this? Or is it too late for that now? Some creatures on one world sent unexpected word to the creatures on another world that they were coming to take over. And the creatures on the other world all cried out, well, it's about time! Or as Galileo said as he rubbed the grain from his eye, are they actually talking about something that might interest me? Or are they back to all that weird internal crap? The mind. Another brief essay. The mind can only know what it knows about any particular thing. And if it tries to comprehend something different that somebody else knows about the same thing, it becomes less certain of what it knew originally. Well, what do you know? The end. One day a certain man paused to muse. If we didn't have the mind, who'd we have to pick on? We now interrupt for this late-breaking health news story. The mind can only take so much. But just how much this might be has yet to be discovered. And now back to our regular whatever it is. Try it this way. What if there is no one mystical way for the simple reason that there is no mystical way? Only people own the mystical way. Or as Mr. Science said upon hearing this, boy, now I'm really confused. One method that can be employed in pursuit of the secret is a continual thinking about thinking. But it must be continual. Whenever you are thinking, you must also at that very same instant be thinking about thinking. A certain mystic once said, no man has ever awakened in a crowd. I'll leave it to you whether I mean this literally or not. So was recently struck one man. If my mind had hands and feet, it wouldn't be just a mind. And his mind popped in. What do you mean just? The simple love to sing their own praises. The sophisticated love to hear theirs sung by others. Who sings for and about the mystics? None, thank God. None, by God. If you don't ask ordinary people for something, they don't believe you ever think about them. One man never asked people for anything. One man asked himself, do I find it interesting that there are more books written about mystics than there are books written by mystics? One guy's motto was, who gives a rat's ass, while his pet rat had an alternative version. One man has presently come to this point. If I am to get anywhere new with my thinking, I must take it outside the confines of my head. The body is indeed a busy place, but not the busiest in man. According to legend, a guy once asked a mystic, if you're awake to the point of realizing that there's no one else more awake than you are, is that as awake as you're going to get? But the mystic said he didn't answer questions like that. The only worthwhile prophet is one who can prophesy his own demise. Now for prophet, substitute the word mind. Now that makes the information worthwhile. And yet another untold version of the creation myth. Life did not drive Adam from paradise, but the other way around, when Adam discovered that life had let the drugs run out. Or, as he brushed the dust from his wings, said Wrong Way Corrigan, sometimes it doesn't seem to matter which way you turn. I figured. And a viewer writes, would you please repeat the one you read about a man who named his thoughts, yeah, 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 yeah. According to history, there were originally two types of mystics, agitated mystics and calm mystics. And one of the two eventually absorbed the other. Hey, Hubert, what you reckon they're talking about now? Actual two types of mystics, or are we back to just inside one guy's head again? The rule of the sea for the mystical salt. Don't let your boat be rocked. And one man's come up with this idea. It doesn't matter so much what you think, just as long as you don't. The great thing about being a mystic, once you're ready to leave, is that there's no one there to see you off of your rights. I was originally fearful that listening to you would drive me crazy, but I'm now far past the stage of mere fear. A certain man visited the grave of one who had known the secret, knelt to one knee, bent close over, and whispered, "Why didn't you leave word how simple and obvious it is?" And the earth whispered back, "Had I done so, would you have ever undertaken that glorious search?" And the man departed that sight, knowing he had moved a bit closer to the one he truly sought. And finally, a certain mystical equestrian pondered, "What is the profit in setting free a wild horse?" Since we have been taping these, and they're now seen all across around the country and a few other places, there's an increasing amount of mail comes in expressing the viewers' interest and pleasure in watching it, but asking very pointedly, just what the hell, what is it? What's the point of it? It is time to address that either again or to some maybe the first time. And without actually going into another history of it, I do want to set up a little quick groundwork for a different reason and point out that all of this, or this specifically, people asking me, well, exactly what's the point? What's it about? It's about what it's always been about. It's a change, a shift. It's a different state of consciousness. And it is not all that weird, it's not all that new, it's not all that old, except it's real old. No matter what era you look to, no matter what area of this planet we take into account, it is there. The Vedic scriptures are filled with overt, covert mentions of it. The, I guess, so-called post-Confucianist thinkers in China referred to it constantly. The early Jewish writers spoke about the whole process from a myriad of views and experiences. Buddha's remembered words are made up almost entirely of references to it. Jesus, a whole handful of lesser-known Middle Eastern so-called religious prophets, Muhammad, then into the European, I guess to wrap it up, the European Middle Age onward Christian mystics spoke of it. And to give a kind of balancing view, you should also keep in mind that as long as this has been going on, there has been references from other sources of men who had no apparent interest in this, sometimes identifiable as being in the scientific, the rational world, have passed off all of this idea of another state of consciousness as being somewhere in this area, being forms of delusion, forms of specious religious trances, even manifestations of physical brain anomalies. And I do not mean now that we're dealing with specific critics of this. I'm just speaking of men that in our day and time, you might find it, if this gives a better idea, you might find it in the area of psychology or psychiatry, that we would assume the writer is a humanist, an agnostic, and is not actually attacking religion as such, but if it's brought up, or if it whatever subject he's speaking on, if the idea of some other state of consciousness comes up, their first inclination, the general inclination, is to classify it as some pathological mental condition. That even if it exists, as might be described to the person, or as he may have read about it throughout the ages, that the kind of literature I had mentioned, that kind of general view from a disinterested scientific mind most commonly would say that if indeed the descriptions given by these kind of mystical writers did take place, that kind of experience took place, and it actually happened to the person more or less as they described it, then all they were describing was a pathological mental condition. That you could call it a different state of consciousness, but it is certainly not a beneficial or desirable one. And they're in fact contemporaries of some of the apparent public mystics and some of the mystics themselves, I'll go ahead and add, that have admitted that they suffered from certain questionable maladies, and it's been attributed to, after the fact sometimes, that the person may have had epilepsy. And I can think of several mystics that by their own apologists, by their contemporary, by their peers, admitted that the person had suffered from some sort of epileptic fits or something similar to it even before they had the name, and that the kind of this altered state of consciousness just seemed to go along with it. That sometimes it happened and seemed to be beneficial, but ever since they were a child they had been suffering from delusions and etc. And as some of you may know, in certain parts of the world, the shamans, or shamans if you're going to write me, have been selected on the basis. I mean shaman not from any particular group of people, but all of the more naturalistic based religious people are oftentimes selected in their group, in their tribe, on the basis that the child, at some early age, the child was having some sort of fits or seemed to black out, go into trances, even before the child was old enough to make any comment about it. That they were selected on the basis that the gods were picking them out and they're already dealing with them on some sort of supra-conscious level. So it is not all of this, I'm just trying to draw up one little temporary ball for you, that it is common knowledge, it has been accepted as being, it's common written history of people claiming that there is another state of consciousness. There are proponents of it who say that they have experienced it. There are histories of it written by contemporaries of those who apparently experienced it, that wrote about it in great detail and even set up organizations and based religions on it. There are people outside the field of interest therein who acknowledge that such may have taken place, but they label it as being an aberration. They label it as being a form of mental pathology rather than a form of a beneficial different form of consciousness. They look at it as being a pathology of consciousness. You have people also, I'll point out, there's no way to prove this, I'm just going to tell you, I'm not going to, that there are millions of people how throughout the years have experienced another state of consciousness. People who had no interest in it, people who are not looking for it, it goes on continuously, but having no interest in it, no preparation for it, it is here and it's gone. If it lingered too long, it simply frightens people, which is very understandable. It should frighten them. Then there are those who have applied themselves a lifetime of trying to seek a different state of consciousness and who never apparently succeeded from their own definition of it, from their own feel for it, that they never succeeded. So rather than beat around the bush anymore from some people's viewpoint out there in TV land, this is what that's about, or this is what this is about, and it is a simple fact. It is, there's another state of consciousness possible. To describe it in any detail as being tied to some teaching, to some philosophy, some religion, is to do it real disservice, more in addition to whatever disservice you run the risk of doing by even talking about it. But to specifically say that it is related to this or that, I assure you is just after the fact. No offense, but childish history. And I say childish on the basis that even those who are apologists, those who are supporters of the idea of another state of consciousness, who have never experienced it, the kinds of people who become a mouthpiece for someone who apparently experienced it after their death. I guess sort of a, whichever one it was, a Peter to Jesus or a Paul to Jesus, that somebody after the fact explains it. Their explanation is not what that Jesus would have explained it as being had he chosen to explain it. It is the responsibility, in quotation marks, of the second generation, if it's going anywhere, if it's going to take on any sort of public life, of someone after the one who experienced the state. And I don't mean an accidental one, you know. I'm speaking about someone that became the core of their life, that became more or less their standard state of consciousness, or at least their benchmark, and that they, it's not a matter whether somebody holds it forever, but it's a matter of whether it was enough of a standard that was the basis of his consciousness. That was the basis of what he was. Then it is always after the life of that person, whoever it may be. If it is going to extend past that, and the majority of them you've never heard of, people who've experienced it to the same kinds of degrees of the public Buddhas and Muhammads and Laos and all those, there have been thousands of others that you never heard of. But the ones you have heard of, which is proof itself that life did give it some viability in the public consciousness, in the public mass consciousness, but it was the person, the mouthpiece, the spokesman after the person who actually had the long-term experience and knew the secret. It was somebody else's responsibility to describe it. And the descriptions are all over the place. It would perhaps seem to a first-time reader. There may be people out in the audience who have read enough that you've already decided that much of it sounds similar. But it would be easy to say that the descriptions of how to go about it seem to roam all over the place, from trying to appeal to gods, to engaging in prayer, to the attempt to blank the mind out. The descriptions that are publicly available that do appear to go right to the heart of the matter. If you found a book or manuscript or a treatise that says how to achieve another state of consciousness as soon as possible or as easily as possible. There may not be one out there, but there are certainly plenty of remembered works laying around under other titles that I won't go into. They're readily available in paperbacks, that is the gist of it. And I do not mean that in a pejorative sense, that it was someone attempting to put it that way. But those who write publicly would never be of such an understanding to go ahead and put it in those simpler words. And even if they were, they would understand enough to know if they put it in those kind of words, it would not attract the right kind of people. They couldn't get it published, and probably their feet would swell up and they couldn't go in their new shoes, and that sort of thing. So you do not find books of any value that say how to most easily achieve another state of consciousness. But the books that are out there, the kinds of manuscripts and kinds of writings that are available under other names, or mine that I just made up that would fit that, would pick out they would have very specific directions, except they're always tied to some system, they're always tied to some background. For instance, the oldest known to man is, you would take from the Vedic writings, from what is now India, and all that general collection. Besides the mythological histories and the tales and etc., if you can read another way, there are many, as I said, overt references to attempts approaches to try to still the mind. And the mythologies of warfare between gods and etc. are full of covert references to it, but back to the overt ones. They talk about the idea, they go into some detail of giving one of the earliest, and this is neither here nor there, when I picked out the so-called Hindu writings. I don't mean to infer that they are in any way more meaty than any more, but they're just the oldest, and maybe the easiest one for me to pick out since it seems to have the most longevity to it that you people might know about. But it goes into very specifics. One of the first, probably, attempts to detail the psychology of man's mind. The kinds of the ways in which it was written, I'm sure even in the native tongue, much less the translations, again, it sounds like it slides all around the place, and it's talking about mythologies and gods and spirits. But it is an early mapping of the psychology of man's mind, the way it works, except it's not referred to as necessarily as mind, it's not referred to as competing aspects of his mind. It can be referred to oftentimes as battles between spirits, between gods. And if you're an ordinary mind, of course, you read it either as mythology or you read it as literal battles between gods, between good gods and evil gods. But they were describing at an early stage the observation that the first mystics or early mystics made once they, through whatever way it came about, through whatever genetic line they were in, that this kind of secret is still being passed around in a kind of bloodline that I won't say whether it's literal or not, take all the fun out, but they were the early mystics, had this knowledge of what another state of consciousness would be, that it was there and it was possible and they had tasted it, and then they recognized, first off, what has to be the ordinary state of consciousness. If you're going to talk about another state, you have to first get people who are not naturally, or as much as the person talking about it, not as attuned to doing it. You have to describe to them first their state of what's going on now, or else they really are like my kind of picturization of they get to the, let's say even the train station in Paris, wherein the mystical Orient Express may head to Istanbul, to the secret. But they'll be running around there sliding on the floor and up and down stairs the rest of their life, not understanding which way to go. And it's necessary that a person have an understanding of where they are internally now. And of course from that comes the drawn out forever idea of know thyself. It's not that much to know, it's just real tricky. And I wrote it in a wider context. One of the news items tonight was the same thing. It's one reason this sounds so difficult is because it's so simple. The idea of knowing thyself, it sounds as though, well, if I'm going to undertake that, I am dealing indeed with a formidable task, a lifetime undertaking. And if that's what you think, that's what you got. It is not that complicated, but it is foreign to man's mind to have any understanding of itself. Even the effort to do it with on a non-weighted basis is strictly unnatural. Because the mind will, anybody's mind will certainly look at itself if prompted to at all in a judgmental fashion, or almost any sane person will nod their agreement that it would be beneficial to know yourself. And you go, yeah. And if you say, well, no, I mean specifically your mental operations, they go, yeah, you're right. And they'd begin, they might even want to participate and give you some indication that they have been so involved themselves, and they'll begin to pick apart the aspects of their thinking with which they find obvious fault. And that has nothing to do with understanding the workings of the mind. If we wanted to be charitable, which doesn't amount to anything, I could say they only understand half, they've only looked at half of it. And when I say charitable, what I mean is useless. Because for a person to pick apart their mind, I wrote that up in the news item if you weren't listening. It said there was once a planet that gave birth to twins. Their names were this and that. You know I don't have a telescope. I'm not talking about cosmology. It's something else. And as long as you think the mind actually consists of this and that, and this is all right, but you know that other stuff, I understand. I got to do something about it. I don't have to welcome you to a club. You are a charter member of the world's largest club. As long as you believe that, and when I say a charter member, you're also a lifetime member. You don't have to renew your membership. There are no further dues required. You will die a fully paid member. The knowing of oneself is to know the operations of the mind, and you cannot study the mind from any ordinary view because it will be weighted. It will be the mind attempting to turn on itself and pick apart the parts that it likes and it dislikes. And I'm not going into the great discussion of that. It's just, I know I could talk for hours or days on that and perhaps get one or two people around to a position that they might see more than they do from me just saying it and brushing on, but I'm not sure it's worth it. Because the reality of it's there. Once you understand that the workings of the human mind is based upon duality, that's it. Then the idea of what falls within that duality is of no consequence, absolutely none. It doesn't matter whether you're interested in politics, religion, whatever the subject is. It always has this and that to it. And if you decide, well, what I've got to do is clean this up, or I've got to get all the that's out of it, and get all the thises into it. You understand, by this and that, I'm inferring, or referring to the fact that the mind finds favor with some of what it thinks about a certain thing, and some of what it doesn't think, especially when it hears what other people think that are in conflict with, that's in conflict with what they think to be correct. But you're stuck there. You're a lifetime member. And when I said it's a charitable description to say that you only got half of it, it's useless. I just want you to see that to see half of it's to see none of it. To say, well, I know, I'm studying my mind, and I understand that a large part of what I call thinking and what my mind does is absolutely erroneous. It's a waste of time. It's foolish. It's distracting. They can call it anything they want to. It's too late. They don't have to tell me anymore, figuratively speaking. As long as you say, well, I know that at least half my, go ahead. I mean, you can walk off and leave them. Or you can walk off and leave you. And you think, well, now I realize at least part of what I think is not, get out of there, children. Get out away from the house as quickly as possible. There's nowhere else to go. You just keep going from one room to another. You think, well, I like it over here in the living room. I'm going to have to clean up that bedroom. You go over there and you think, well, the bedroom's not so bad. And you look back to the living room, you think, that thing's got to be remodeled. And you go back over there and you think, well, it's not as bad as I thought now that I'm here. And you look back to the bedroom and you go, God, that wallpaper. And you go back over to the bedroom. And then you look back to the living room and you think, wait a minute, I should go back over there. That's a lot better shape than I thought. I just need a different view. And you go back over there and you look at the bedroom and you go, how can I let it stay like that? The people writing about it, I was going to get back to the Vedic scriptures. It's not the overt sides. After they start trying to map out the mind in the various ways they do, they start pointing out many thousands of years ago by ordinary history, very specific ways to go about it. That what you had to do, and within the scriptures or within the collections known as the Vedic literature, I am aware that they're conflicting in various ones, and I'm just picking out in general, or just at random almost, but they're all pointing to the same thing. The idea that a man could, that if he's going to bring his mind under any control, if he's going to reach any other state of consciousness, if he's going to uncover the Atman in him, if he's going to become one with the Godhead, if he's going to get past the illusion of what he is, which is I just got through describing, because the illusion of what a man is not this. That's only real simple people think. That's what they like to believe, is this is all an illusion. You know, it may be, but those same kind of people do not want you to hit them in the head with a hammer. That is not the illusion. That is not the illusion that the mystics have always spoken of. The illusion is that this thing is what it claims to be. And it says, well, I am. You go, you're not. And you go, okay, now you're right. Part of me is not. And people will stay there for 60 years dealing with that, believing they're onto something, which I had the man tonight pointed out that one guy had finally come to this conclusion, that believing that the thoughts you think are actually getting you somewhere is like believing that you can dust and vacuum the planet. I probably, based upon your reaction, don't have to explain, but you understand it's like, well, you look around and a large part of this planet is dusty and kind of dirty. But you think we got the wherewithal now, technically, that I can vacuum up. Okay. It's like vacuuming your house. You think, well, I got most of the dust up for today. What do you do with it? Well, you have to go outside and dump it, finally. You do understand that there's sort of a, how should we put it? There's sort of a, with non-ending process. Would that be acceptable to most people? That is the mind at the ordinary level dealing with itself with the best intentions. They tried to point out that their first method, some of the earliest recorded methods, was to physically sit still, stand still, get in some position, try to isolate yourself, and then try and now I can pick them out at random, try and focus the mind. And then with ordinary people, from any ordinary view, you have to give them something to focus on. And then it's almost an inevitable step that either the man, the spokesman for whoever originally did this, will then begin almost inevitably to stick in some reference to supreme beings. Now that is not necessarily a misdirection. At one time, let us say it was not. But the idea now of supreme being, the idea of some cosmic force, some creative force, like the core reactor of all of reality, is now so tied up to the idea of an actual anthropomorphic figure extrinsic to the system of our reality. In other words, the God up in the heavens. It is now, the whole idea of a supreme being is now so tied to that, is why it's almost impossible to use it and have anybody, even when they have the best intentions and the biggest of ears, to get past the point of, oh, that there is something out there to rely on, that there is something outside the system that's going to encourage you, that's going to help you. There's something to which you can, a force to, which you can petition through prayer, through good works or something, that may interfere, that may intrude inside this closed system. You can look at the closed system as being our universe, and up here in your universe, that it will come in extrinsically, that it's based, it's outside here, that it created it, and now it stands aside, but you can, through certain efforts, appeal to it, and it will come in and affect a change on you. The change, if it's possible, all of them knew. I mean, it's not open to debate, it's not speculation. There's only one possible way it comes about, and it's through effort you make. So they started off and they said, one of the versions is to be still and try and focus the mind. And it was not a mistake, because the first person that ever said that understood it, then the person that they may have been addressing, and the person, their hearer with the best intentions and with real big good ears, went, well, on what? And so he had to go, okay, on something. So he came up with something. And you can also see, this is a little off the point, but you can also see traces of the original mystics in any area, and perhaps their first generation followers. They did struggle against this, because you can see traces of the earliest versions of many of the mystical systems were very vague, that really seemed to just be running all over the map, and it's like it took them another generation to settle down and to focus. Give you an idea. How about the idea of all of the thousands of guides in the Hindu scriptures? I mean, literally, somebody finally got down and counted it, and it was into the thousands. And there's reference in there some places, if you didn't like any of those, make up your own. Literally, literally. But now you give that to an ordinary person, it was like that they had to go, well, you know, they tried that for a generation or two, or whatever length of time you'd care to frame it in. And it's like the people that even tried to follow the idea to start with, that there's another state of consciousness, and that's what all of these writings are about, now known as the Vedic literature, but somebody sometime thousands of years ago, once it started being collected, let's say, and somebody starts reading and they realize, well, this is about the thing that interests me. And I like the description. Finally, somebody here is telling me, be still somewhere, get off by yourself, and try and focus your attention And the person goes, ah, I like it. Try to put yourself back to the first person that ever read that, or the first time you ever heard it. And well, I like that. Focus your attention. But then he thought, well, on what? I like it, but focus on what? Somebody tell me. And you understand, it was like the first guy who ever realized this. I'm just having to shortcut it now. He wanted to tell him that. But he didn't want to lie. He wanted to lie as little as possible. He wanted to misdirect as little as possible. So instead of saying, all right, focus on Allah, focus on Brahma, he went, okay, all right, look, you do have to focus on something. So here's what we should do is we should focus on the source or something that represents a higher state of consciousness. And the first guy that heard it went, like it, so what? And he goes, well, the idea of a supreme being. I like it. Is that just called supreme being? And they go, well, all right, look, I might as well admit to you, you've heard the idea of the gods, somebody created the universe, like Brahma, yeah. Okay, well, it's not just Brahma that you've been hearing about. Now, I know I'm mixing up history, but let's assume that they'd already using the term Brahma, and the first guy that understood higher state of consciousness told his first potential hearer, so, all right, you've heard about Brahma, the guy that, inhales and reality comes to be, and he went, yeah, I've heard that. And go, all right, that's what ordinary people mean to represent. But now don't take the idea of Brahma, see, because by then it had already been misused enough to where his first potential hearer would be too misled by it. So he went, it's not a Brahma. They had to say that because that's all ordinary people wanted to hear. There's actually 2,422 different Brahmas. So you can focus on any of them. But you understand now, I'm really stretching this. But he was trying to keep this first potential hearer from getting too identified that this is tied to one specific thing that he had already heard. But he had to answer something. He said, you got to focus your mind. And the guy said, I like it. On what? And he went, well, all right, you know the idea of Brahma, because the idea of God always represents a higher state of consciousness. It is one of the few things, give it its credit, even at its lowest level, with any group of people, no matter how simplistic, no matter how uncivilized and unsophisticated, at least their conception of God is one thing in their lives, in their collective lives, that represents something about the potential of man. It is something that is uplifting and challenging, even if they only think about it once a year, even if they only think about it when they're about to die or they're sick. The rest of the time, what do people think about? The rest of the time, what kind of information, what kind of entertainment, what kind of social activities? What does the trappings of civilization consist of? Mostly looking to the past, mostly bad news, mostly appeals to the absolute lowest common instinctive denominator of man. There's no problem, it works. But if you're going out in the public marketplace and expect I'll find some specific challenge, they'll never be able to revoke your card. You're a member of that club forever. But at least religion, at least the idea of God, of a Brahma, at least that represents, at least one time in that group, that civilization's, man's environment, one idea that is uplifting, that is challenging, that is that when you think about it, it is something higher than the people thinking about it. I mean, that's the whole concept of God. No matter how low the person is, no matter how simplistic they are, if they're in a society somewhere, if they're in an environment that has a concept of God, and they understand as well as anybody else, then every time they think of their God, at least at one time, at least at that moment, they're thinking at some level approaching, or some level pushing, further than the common denominator. They're at least approaching something challenging. They're at least thinking about something higher than their own state. But I was going to say that the first guy that understood that said, all right, there are 2,400 and whatever I said, different Brahmas, so it's not the one that you always heard. So you just pick out any one you like. And in fact, if you don't like any of them, he doesn't mind. There's always room for one more. Now, taking my thwarted history here, you understand that after that got out a little bit, however long it was, then the next generation, the next mystic that came along, the next guy that knew the secret, he went, well, I understand, the people can't take this. And so they had to keep narrowing it down, till they considered a major breakthrough. In the West, we attribute it to the Judaic faith, the first one, and There have been others, but anyway, that's the first major one, that, hey, there's one God. Throw all these other gods out, We got too many gods, we don't need them. There's one God. There is the core, as far as I'm going to get tonight, of the problem of the first kind of, historically, from my rough telling, of the first direct, detailed method of how to go about trying to achieve how to reach this other state of consciousness is, first, you have to do something about your present state. And to do something about your present state, you've got to focus it. And it was not just the focusing any more than it is to tell somebody that they should be trying to know themselves. Because if you had known the shortcut to that, the whole thing about trying to know yourself was that if you were the right kind of mystic, or would-be mystic to start with, you tried to study yourself for a little bit and you realized, wait a minute. I'm like a man with his hands covered in Vaseline trying to study an eel that's invisible. In other words, I'm trying to study something, and what the hell is it? That should be the first realization. And in the same way, it'd be somebody finally thinking, well, I'm going to focus my mind. It's not just to focus the mind to start with. The first shock, the first lesson is to realize the condition, the ordinary condition and workings of the human mind. Mm-hmm. But unless you look at it by trying to focus it, and you tell somebody, if you try to describe to somebody the way the mind works, they'll never hear it. I mean, they'll go on forever. Well, what's your credentials? Wait a minute, what school of psychology? Well, what are you from? No matter what you say about this, about the mind, they'll counter with that. And then you got to tell them the story about the planet that gave, and they're going, what? No. If you do not see on your own the conditions, the working condition of the human mind, then there's nowhere to go. You'll never get out of the train station. And one of the ways to go about it is to give first what seems to be a very specific method. Focus your attention. And I'm going to pick this back up. And it's not that that is invalid. It's not that that will not go further, but the first lesson should be that somebody seriously attempt that. The first lesson is a lesson in the condition of their mind, the condition under which the normal operating conditions of the human mind. That's the first thing that they should learn by trying to focus attention. Because if you do not do that, again, assuming you're the right kind of person, it wouldn't necessarily have any effect that I'm describing on anybody at random. But if you do not do that, if you do not focus it, you'll never see for yourself the condition of the human mind. You won't see how it operates. You can read about it. I could tell you, and you'll read about it, and you go, well, wait a minute. Okay, well, all right, so part of that may be true. That part I agree with. This part, no. If you don't see it for yourself, you don't see it. I'll see you.